This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Today, we investigate a startling historical puzzle. How did a fragmented, impoverished region representing just 8% of the world's landmass come to dominate the other 92%? We will travel from the muddy fields of the Middle Ages to the high-stakes tournament of gunpowder warfare and the fossil-fueled leap of the Industrial Revolution. This is the story of how Western Europe transformed from a chaotic backwater into a global titan, leaving a legacy that still shapes our world today. Join us as we uncover the foundations of European power. Chapter 1: The Pre-Industrial Ascent: Foundations of European Power. In the year 900, Western Europe was an impoverished, violent, and politically chaotic backwater. It was a region of tiny, struggling villages and almost no cities to speak of, with the notable exception of Cordoba, which was then part of the thriving Muslim world. For the average inhabitant of Western Europe, luxuries like silk, perfume, and spices were virtually non-existent, and the few that arrived were so expensive that only the most elite could dream of them. The major form of long-distance commerce was a brutal slave trade led by Vikings, and the primary exports were furs and human beings. At this moment in history, the Middle East and southern China were the world's centers of light, wealth, and sophisticated scholarship. China was on the verge of an agricultural and technological revolution under the Song dynasty, and the Islamic world was preserving and extending the scientific knowledge of ancient Greece, which remained entirely unknown to Europeans. Yet by 1914, this once pitiful collection of fragmented territories had undergone a transformation so radical that it seemed impossible. Europeans had gained control of a staggering 84% of the globe. They ruled colonies on every inhabited continent and had spread their languages, legal systems, and religions to the furthest reaches of the earth. This dominance was not merely a product of the Industrial Revolution. Long before the first steam engine hissed into life, the trajectory of European power was already climbing. By 1800, before industrialization had truly taken hold in Britain, and while the rest of the continent remained largely agrarian, Europeans already held sway over 35% of the planet. Their armed ships were already preying on trade routes as far away as Southeast Asia and had been doing so for 3 centuries. To understand how a region representing only 8% of the world's landmass came to dominate the other 92%, one must look at the centuries of slow, structural change that began in the Middle Ages. The first signs of this ascent were found in the dirt of the fields. Between the 6th and 9th centuries, Northern Europe developed a series of agricultural innovations that fundamentally altered its productive capacity. The introduction of the moldboard plow, a heavy iron tool capable of turning the thick, moist clay soils of the north, allowed for the cultivation of land that had previously been too difficult to farm. This was paired with the invention of the horse collar and horseshoes, which allowed horses to replace slower oxen as the primary source of power. A horse could work longer and faster, significantly increasing the amount of land a single peasant could manage. Furthermore, the shift from a 2-field to a 3-field crop rotation system meant that only a third of the land lay fallow at any given time, rather than half. This system of agriculture was the most productive the world had ever seen in terms of labor. It produced a surplus of food that supported a growing population and allowed more people to move into cities, fueling the growth of commerce and industry. As the population grew and stabilized following the end of the Viking and Magyar invasions in the 10th century, Western Europe entered the High Middle Ages, a period of renewed prosperity and territorial expansion. This era saw the birth of the modern university, with institutions appearing in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These were not just centers of religious study, but places where Roman law was rediscovered and applied to the governance of emerging states. This intellectual foundation was critical. It created a framework for stable succession, property rights, and the professional bureaucracies that would eventually manage global empires. These universities were unique as self-governing corporate entities, providing a level of intellectual independence that allowed scholars to explore ideas outside the direct control of the church or the state. Complementing this institutional growth was the emergence of the Republic of Letters. This was a pan-European institution of intellectuals who used Latin as a lingua franca to share ideas across hostile borders. Even when their respective kings were at war, scholars in London, Paris, and Rome exchanged letters, manuscripts, and discoveries. This created an integrated market for ideas that bypassed local censorship and ensured that a breakthrough in one kingdom would quickly benefit the entire continent. This intellectual network fostered a culture of critical inquiry and technical sharing that was essential for the later scientific revolution. The mid-15th century brought another pivotal shift: the invention of the movable type printing press in Mainz around 1440. Within just 60 years, the press had spread to 270 European cities, producing over 20 million volumes. This explosion of literacy and the rapid diffusion of technical knowledge was a uniquely European phenomenon. While China had invented printing much earlier, its political unity and the nature of its imperial examination system meant that the technology was not used to challenge the status quo or spread heterodox ideas in the same way. In the fragmented landscape of Europe, a scholar or inventor suppressed in one kingdom could simply flee to a neighboring state, taking their ideas with them. This political pluralism created a competitive market for ideas, where states were forced to innovate or be left behind by their rivals. This competitive drive was sharpened by necessity. For centuries, Europeans had a limitless demand for the luxury goods of the East, particularly spices like pepper, cloves, and nutmeg. However, the trade routes were long, perilous, and dominated by Muslim middlemen. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, the traditional links to the Silk Road were further squeezed. This created a powerful economic incentive to find a direct sea route to Asia. The Europeans were motivated by a sense of relative poverty. They believed their continent was the poorest part of the known world, and they were desperate to access the riches they knew existed elsewhere. The quest for these riches was led by Portugal, a small kingdom on the edge of the Atlantic. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, the Portuguese began a systematic effort to explore the West African coast. Henry's efforts were uniquely sustained by his position as the head of the Order of Christ, the military successor to the Portuguese Knights Templar. This role provided him with a crucial and independent source of income to fund maritime explorations that would have been too expensive for the royal treasury alone. The chronicler Gomez Yanez de Azarara recorded 5 specific motives for Henry's persistence. First, the desire for knowledge of lands beyond Cape Bojador. Second, the hope of establishing profitable trade. Third, the need to measure the military strength of the Moors. Fourth, the search for other Christian rulers who might help in the fight against Islamic powers. And fifth, the desire to spread the Christian faith. These motives combined religious crusading with cold economic and strategic calculation. The exploration was a grueling process of trial and error. In the 1420s and 1430s, the Portuguese colonized the Madeira Islands and the Azores, the latter being nearly 750 miles from the coast. These islands served as vital stepping stones and testing grounds for colonization techniques before the Portuguese reached the African mainland. The expansion was not without friction. In the Canary Islands, the Portuguese were repulsed by the fierce resistance of the native Guanches. This failure provoked a territorial protest from Castile, illustrating that inter-European colonial rivalry was present from the very beginning of the Age of Discovery. For years, sailors were terrified to venture beyond Cape Bojador, believing that the winds and shallow waters made navigation impossible. It took 15 failed ventures before Gil Yanez finally succeeded in rounding the Cape in 1434. This breakthrough was made possible by the development of the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable ship with lateen sails that allowed it to sail against the wind. Interestingly, the design of the caravel was not a purely European invention. It was based on North African fishing boats that the Portuguese had observed and adapted. Combined with the astrolabe and the magnetic compass, the caravel gave the Portuguese the means to traverse the open sea with a degree of certainty that no other civilization possessed. By the time the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, they had established a template for colonization. They built fortified trading posts along the coast, used naval superiority to enforce trade monopolies, and sent outcasts from the homeland to populate new territories. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, he bypassed the traditional middlemen entirely, forever altering the balance of global trade. While Portugal pushed east, Spain looked west. The unification of Castile and Aragon and the final defeat of the Moors at Granada in 1492 allowed the Spanish crown to focus on overseas expansion. Christopher Columbus's voyage in that same year was a gamble born of the same desperation for Eastern spices. Although he failed to find a shorter route to India, he stumbled upon the Americas, providing Europe with a vast expanse of fertile land and an enormous influx of silver and gold. While Portugal pushed east, Spain looked west. The unification of Castile and Aragon and the final defeat of the Moors at Granada in 1492 allowed the Spanish crown to focus on overseas expansion. Christopher Columbus's voyage in that same year was a gamble born of the same desperation for Eastern spices. Although he failed to find a shorter route to India, he stumbled upon the Americas, providing Europe with a vast expanse of fertile land and an enormous influx of silver and gold. Crucially, these early voyages were not just state-sponsored missions, they were often private-public partnerships. In Europe, entrepreneurs were free to use maritime and military technology to mount their own expeditions of conquest and trade. The Spanish crown, lacking the tax revenue to pay for a massive colonial administration, relied on private conquerors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro. These men were essentially private contractors who signed legal agreements with the crown, providing their own funding and men in exchange for a share of the loot and administrative titles in the new territories. This model allowed the Spanish to topple vast civilizations like the Aztecs and Incas using tiny groups of men, as the conquerors were motivated by the prospect of immense personal wealth and were willing to form opportunistic alliances with indigenous groups hostile to the existing empires. The success of these private ventures led to the creation of the first joint stock companies, such as the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and the English East India Company, EIC, in the early 17th century. These were revolutionary organizational structures that allowed thousands of investors to pool their capital, spreading the risk of long-distance trade while raising sums of money that no single monarch could match. These companies were granted the power to wage war, coin money, and establish colonies, acting as private arms of foreign policy. This fusion of private profit and state-sanctioned power created a self-sustaining engine of expansion that was not found in the large centralized empires of Asia. In China, the massive treasure fleets of Admiral Zheng He had explored the Indian Ocean and reached the coast of Africa nearly a century before Columbus. His ships were 5 times larger than anything the Europeans possessed, and his crews numbered in the tens of thousands. However, because China was a unified empire, a single imperial decree was enough to end the voyages. The emperor eventually ordered the expeditions to stop, seeing no gain in contact with the outside world and fearing the drain on the treasury. The ships were left to rot, and the technology was lost. In the fragmented world of Europe, no such single authority existed to halt the march toward the horizon. If one king stopped exploring, his rival would simply take his place. By 1500, Europe's advanced political and economic organization had already given it a decisive edge. The region had moved from a state of total backwardness to become a powerhouse of innovation. The combination of high-productivity agriculture, the rapid spread of knowledge through the printing press and the Republic of Letters, and the development of sophisticated private-public partnerships created a unique environment. This environment fostered a single-minded focus on the tools of expansion and the means to fund them, creating a relentless competitive pressure that would soon find its most lethal expression on the battlefield. Chapter 2. The Tournament of Blood and Gunpowder. The rise of Western Europe was driven by a single-minded, almost obsessive focus on the art of destruction. While other civilizations were often more advanced in their internal governance or cultural refinement, the states of Western Europe were evolving into machines for waging war. This transformation was the result of a peculiar political and economic environment that functioned like a high-stakes, winner-take-all tournament. To understand this tournament model, as described by Philip Hoffman, one can look to a modern analogy, a professional baseball team. In this scenario, political leaders are the coaches, and the wars they wage are the games. Just as a coach is incentivized to hire better players and adopt better strategies to win more games, European monarchs were driven to invest in the most advanced military technology and the most effective soldiers to secure victory on the battlefield. This obsession with military glory was fueled by a political structure that shielded leaders from the true costs of their ambitions. European kings and princes were raised from childhood to pursue glory. For them, war was the ultimate arena for personal and dynastic prestige. As Galileo famously observed, war was a royal sport, a sentiment echoed by Niccolò Machiavelli, who argued that a prince should have no object, thought, or profession but war. Crucially, these monarchs bore almost none of the costs of their warmongering. Unlike the leaders of more centralized empires, European monarchs faced remarkably low personal stakes. They faced not even the risk of losing their thrones after a defeat. If a campaign failed, the treasury might be emptied and the peasantry might starve, but the king remained a king. This imbalance created a relentless drive to take up arms, as the rewards of victory, new territory, and a legacy of greatness were immense, while the consequences of failure were externalized. The engine that powered this incessant warfare was a revolutionary fiscal system designed to extract every possible cent from the population. To stay in the tournament, a leader needed vast sums of money to pay for the players, the mercenaries, the professional standing armies, and the ever-evolving technology of gunpowder. By the 17th century, the most successful European states had developed an extraordinary ability to tax. This was not because Europe was inherently wealthier than China or the Ottoman Empire. In fact, per capita wealth was often comparable. The difference lay in the state's capacity to extract that wealth. In countries like France and Great Britain, real per capita tax revenue increased 15-fold or more over just 2 centuries. By the late 18th century, per capita taxes were 15 times higher in France than in China, and a staggering 40 times higher in England. To illustrate this single-minded focus on war, one need only look at the spending habits of the most famous absolute monarch, Louis XIV. While the massive Palace of Versailles is often cited as the pinnacle of royal extravagance, it actually cost the Sun King less than 2% of his tax revenue. The remaining 98% was swallowed by the costs of war or the servicing of debts incurred from previous conflicts. This ratio was not unique to France. Across the continent, the state was essentially a giant vacuum designed to suck up resources and blow them out of the barrel of a cannon. The primary focus of this investment was gunpowder technology. Although the Chinese had invented gunpowder, it was the Europeans who pushed it to its absolute limits through a process of learning by doing. Gunpowder weapons, artillery, firearms, and armed ships were uniquely suited to improvement through trial and error. Because Europe was a landscape of small, geographically close, and fiercely competitive states, every war provided a new opportunity to test a weapon's range, accuracy, or reliability. If one nation developed a better way to cast a cannon or a more effective tactic for using musketeers, its neighbors were forced to either copy the innovation or face destruction. This environment of rapid imitation meant that European military technology advanced at a pace unseen elsewhere. A striking example of this process can be seen in the evolution of the warship. In 1628, the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus constructed the Vasa, a massive two-decked gunship. However, the ship was poorly designed and sank in the harbor shortly after setting sail. In a different political context, such a failure might have led a ruler to abandon the project. But in the European tournament, the Swedish Navy and its rivals studied the disaster, learned from the mistakes in the ship's center of gravity, and kept building. By the 18th century, European navies were launching stable, maneuverable warships with 2 or more gun decks that possessed longer range and greater firepower than anything else on the seas. This relentless pace of innovation was not matched in the great empires of the East, largely because their tactical needs were fundamentally different. In China, the primary military threat did not come from rival states with similar gunpowder technology, but from nomads on horseback from the northern steppes. Against these fast-moving archers, heavy, slow-loading musketeers and cumbersome cannons were often ineffective. Consequently, Chinese tax money went to archers on horseback because they were more effective against nomads than slow-loading musketeers. It was a rational tactical trade-off. The Chinese military focused its resources on traditional forms of fighting that met their specific strategic needs, rather than entering an arms race for a technology that offered little immediate advantage against their most frequent enemies. Similarly, the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan provides a lesson in what happens when the tournament ends. In the 16th century, Japan was as proficient in gunpowder technology as any European nation, even pioneering the tactic of volley fire. However, once the shogunate unified the country and established a long-lasting peace, the incentive to innovate vanished. Without the pressure of constant competition, the government restricted firearms to maintain social order. Japan's military technology stagnated, remaining frozen in time while Europe's continued to accelerate under the pressure of the tournament. In the Ottoman Empire, the situation was different again. While the Ottomans were expert users of gunpowder and possessed high-quality artillery, they lacked the specific combination of political and fiscal incentives that drove the Western tournament. Their state was large and diverse, making it difficult to centralize tax collection to the degree seen in England or France. While they could buy the latest weapons or hire European experts, they were not the ones driving the underlying research and development. They were consumers of the technology, not the ones pushing the frontier of what was possible. By the 18th century, the gap between Europe and the rest of the world had become insurmountable. The technology had grown to include not just guns and ships, but an entire system of supply, logistics, and fortifications. One of the most important developments was the Trace Italienne, a new style of fortification with low, thick walls and star-shaped bastions designed to resist artillery fire. These forts were incredibly expensive to build and required professionalized armies to defend, further raising the entry fee for the military tournament. This mastery of technology allowed a relatively small number of Europeans to exercise an outsized influence on the global stage. Gunpowder weapons became the ultimate force multiplier, as demonstrated by Hernán Cortés, whose use of custom-built, cannon-armed brigantines allowed a small force to overcome the aquatic defenses of the Aztec capital. The European tournament also benefited from a pervasive, if mistaken, belief that the continent was the poorest part of the known world. This sense of relative poverty drove a desperate search for wealth abroad, as leaders and merchants were convinced they had to find a way to the riches of the East to survive and compete with their neighbors. To a European king, the world was a treasure chest that had to be pried open with the force of gunpowder. As the 19th century dawned, the advantages gained through the tournament were magnified by the Industrial Revolution. The innovations in applied science were quickly applied to the military sector, allowing Europeans to improve their technology through systematic scientific inquiry into chemistry, metallurgy, and ballistics. By 1914, the once backward collection of warring tribes in Western Europe had become the masters of the globe. They had achieved this through a centuries-long process of political and military selection. The incessant fighting had groomed leaders who were victorious in war and had hardened political borders that prevented any single power from unifying the continent. This fragmentation ensured that the tournament never ended, forcing states to continuously innovate or perish. The extraordinary ability to tax and the freedom given to private entrepreneurs to use violence for profit served as the fuel for this military engine. This sustained investment in the tools of violence created a path of development that was unique to the West, raising the question of how these same tools of war would be turned toward the systematic administration and economic restructuring of the territories they had conquered. Chapter 3: The Great Divergence: Energy, Institutions, and the Fossil Fuel Leap. For much of human history, the idea that a small group of nations on the western tip of Eurasia would eventually dictate the economic terms of the entire planet would have seemed like a statistical impossibility. To understand how this happened, we must look at the Great Divergence, the moment when the Western world broke free from the Malthusian constraints that had limited the growth of every other civilization for thousands of years. While earlier chapters established that Europe's organizational foundations were shifting as early as 1500, a significant scholarly debate exists regarding when the West truly pulled ahead. Traditionalists argue for a deep-seated European lead rooted in the late Middle Ages, but the California school of historians, led by Kenneth Pomeranz, suggests a different timeline. They argue that as late as 1750, the most developed parts of Asia, specifically the Yangtze Delta in China, were on a remarkably similar economic footing to England or the Netherlands. The evidence for this parity is found in grain wages, or the amount of food a laborer's daily pay could buy. In terms of caloric intake and basic standard of living, a peasant in the Yangtze Delta likely enjoyed a life comparable to a laborer in the English countryside well into the 18th century. However, a different metric reveals a hidden chasm: silver wages. Research by Stephen Broadberry and others shows that by 1600, silver wages in London and Amsterdam were already 3 times higher than those in the Yangtze Delta. While both workers could buy similar amounts of food locally, the European worker possessed significantly more global purchasing power. This allowed Europeans to dominate international trade, buying up Asian silks, porcelains, and spices, while Asian consumers found European manufactured goods prohibitively expensive. This silver wage gap was an early warning sign of the divergence that would soon become a vertical ascent. This leads to the Needham question, named after the scholar Joseph Needham. Why did China, which led the world in technology for centuries, not undergo its own scientific and industrial revolution? China had invented the compass, gunpowder, and printing long before Europe, yet it reached a high-level equilibrium trap. Economist Justin Yifu Lin provides a crucial distinction to explain this. Before the 14th century, technological progress was driven by learning by doing, a process of trial and error, where a larger population, like China's, provided more opportunities for accidental discovery. However, the Industrial Revolution required a shift from empirical observation to experimentation and theory. While China's imperial examination system funneled the brightest minds into the study of Confucian classics to maintain social stability, Europe began to embrace what Niall Ferguson calls the 6 killer apps of prosperity: competition, the scientific method, property rights, modern medicine, consumerism, and the work ethic. Geography provided the stage for these apps to run, but in a more specific sense than mere climate or soil. Ian Morris describes the Atlantic as a Goldilocks ocean. Compared to the vast, daunting Pacific, the Atlantic was the perfect size, large enough to require advanced maritime technology, but small enough to be crossed regularly, creating a geographic windfall for those on its eastern shores. This proximity allowed for a unique feedback loop of trade and innovation that was physically impossible for the isolated empires of the East. The most decisive geographic factor, however, was the distribution of energy. As Europe faced a looming timber crisis due to deforestation, Britain found itself sitting upon massive, accessible deposits of coal. This was a sheer stroke of luck. Many of these deposits were located near the surface and close to water transportation. In contrast, China's largest coal reserves were located in the arid northwest, far from the industrial heartland of the south. The transition to coal was not just a change in fuel, it was a transition to a new type of economy. Because British coal mines were notoriously prone to flooding, there was a direct, localized incentive to solve the problem of mine drainage. This led to the development of the Newcomen steam engine. While initially an inefficient atmospheric engine, it represented the first time human beings had successfully converted heat into mechanical work. Without the specific, localized pressure of wet coal mines, the steam engine might have remained a laboratory curiosity, much like the steam toys of ancient Alexandria. While coal provided the power, institutional innovations provided the legal and financial framework for the divergence. Drawing on the foundations of Roman law, European states formalized property rights and the rule of law to a degree unseen elsewhere. Ferguson identifies property rights as a killer app because they provided a predictable environment for long-term investment. In many other parts of Eurasia, wealth was often held at the whim of a local official or a central monarch, which discouraged capital accumulation. In Europe, the development of patent systems turned the pursuit of knowledge into a profitable enterprise, ensuring that inventors could reap the rewards of their creativity. These institutions also gave European states a massive advantage in fiscal capacity. Following the Glorious Revolution in England, the power to tax and spend was moved to Parliament. Because the government was now seen as a credible borrower that could not arbitrarily default on its debts, it could borrow money at significantly lower interest rates than its rivals. European taxation levels and debt capacity now far exceeded those of the Qing or Ottoman empires. This allowed the British state to fund its navy and its industrial infrastructure through credit, effectively spending future wealth to secure present dominance. The divergence was also shaped by the way different societies valued labor. Justin Yifu Lin notes that in a world of learning by doing, a large population is an asset. But in a world of experimentation and theory, a large population can become a labor trap. In China and India, labor was so cheap and abundant that there was little incentive to build machines to replace it. In Britain, high silver wages and cheap energy created the opposite condition. It was economically rational to build expensive machines to replace expensive human labor. This high-wage, cheap energy environment was the specific cradle of the Industrial Revolution. As these internal drivers, the energy leap of coal, the theoretical shift in science, and the institutional protection of property converged, they created a world where Western Europe was no longer just one of many advanced civilizations, but the clear global leader. The economic engines of the West were now running at a speed that the rest of the world would struggle to match. This transition from domestic growth to global supremacy was not merely about internal innovation. It was about the ability to project this new power outward. The tools of the Great Divergence, the steam engine, the patent, and the credit market, were about to be applied to the systematic restructuring of the global map. Chapter 4: The Global Ledger of Extraction. The rise of Western Europe was fundamentally driven by a calculated and often brutal economic strategy that transformed the globe into a vast, interconnected machine for the accumulation of capital. As the early modern era dawned, the fragmented kingdoms of the West moved beyond mere exploration to embrace mercantilism, an economic theory that equated a nation's strength with its hoard of gold and silver. This logic dictated that the world's wealth was a finite pie. For one nation to grow, another had to shrink. To secure their slice, European powers turned colonies into the essential pistons of an economic engine designed to provide cheap raw materials and serve as captive markets for finished goods. While the foundations of overseas trade were laid by the first joint stock companies, the true financial innovation that powered this era was the creation of a sophisticated capital market. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, revolutionized the business of empire by becoming the first enterprise to issue tradable shares of stock. This allowed capital to be mobilized with unprecedented fluidity, as investors could buy and sell their stakes in the company's success without waiting for a voyage to return. This financial architecture turned the risks of global trade into a liquid asset, providing a steady stream of funding for the expansion of Dutch influence in the East. The fuel for this emerging system was the massive influx of American bullion, but the consequences of this wealth were more complex than a simple increase in royal treasuries. The mountain of silver extracted from Potosi triggered a price revolution across Europe, a century-long period of significant inflation. While this devalued the fixed incomes of the old landed nobility, it acted as a massive stimulus for the merchant class and allowed states to manage unprecedented levels of debt. This silver did not just sit in coffers. It provided the reliable currency that lubricated the entire European economy and allowed the West to finally purchase its way into the lucrative markets of Asia, where European manufactured goods were otherwise in low demand. As the Spanish and Portuguese empires began to stretch under the weight of their own success, the British and French sought more specific trade concessions to gain an edge. One of the most vile engine details of this era was the asiento, a monopoly on the slave trade to the Spanish colonies in the Americas. This trade concession became a prized geopolitical trophy, eventually granted to the British in the Treaty of Utrecht. The asiento became the basis for the South Sea Company and integrated the horrific efficiency of the slave trade directly into the heart of London's financial district. It was a mechanism that turned human suffering into a standardized, tradable commodity, providing the capital that would eventually fund the infrastructure of the early Industrial Revolution. This created the infamous triangular trade system, a cycle of exploitation that linked 3 continents. European traders shipped manufactured goods, textiles, rum, and firearms to the West African coast to be exchanged for enslaved people. These individuals were then transported across the Atlantic in the nightmare of the Middle Passage to work the plantations of the Americas. The sugar, tobacco, and cotton they produced were shipped back to Europe to be processed, starting the cycle anew. The profitability of this system was staggering because it externalized the cost of labor. In the Caribbean, tiny islands like Barbados were transformed into sugar factories, where the labor of millions of enslaved Africans provided the cheap, abundant energy that allowed the plantation economy to flourish. The economic transformation of India provides the most striking example of how this engine could systematically dismantle a sophisticated economy to serve the needs of a European power. In the 17th century, India was a global manufacturing powerhouse, accounting for nearly a quarter of the world's industrial output. Its cotton textiles were so superior that the British government passed protectionist laws to ban their import. However, following the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the British East India Company transitioned from a trading partner to a political sovereign. The mechanism for India's economic subjugation was the dastak, a permit for duty-free trade. The company used these permits to exempt its own goods from the internal customs duties that local Indian merchants were still required to pay. This created a rigged market where Indian producers could not compete with British traders in their own country. Furthermore, the company used the tax revenue collected from Indian peasants to purchase Indian goods for export. This meant that Britain was effectively getting Indian products for free, a drain of wealth that stripped the subcontinent of its capital. The most damaging blow was the deliberate deindustrialization of the Indian textile industry. To ensure that British mills in Lancashire had no competition, the British government imposed heavy tariffs on Indian cloth, while allowing British machine-made textiles to enter India duty-free. The city of Dhaka, once the world's premier center for fine muslins, saw its population plummet from 150,000 to just 30,000 as its looms fell silent. India was forcibly transformed from the world's leading manufacturer into a mere supplier of raw cotton for British factories and a captive market for their finished products. By the time of independence, India's share of global manufacturing had been crushed to a mere 2%. The scale of this resource extraction is best understood through the specific calculation of ghost acreage. By the mid-19th century, the New World exports of wood, cotton, and wool saved England the need for 23 to 25 million acres of its own cultivated land. This was more than the total land area of England itself. This geographic windfall allowed the English population to move into industrial cities and focus on manufacturing, without the Malthusian threat of a food or fuel shortage. The colonies provided the ecological space that the British Isles lacked, functioning as a massive external farm and forest that fueled the transition to industrial capitalism. As the first industrial revolution gave way to the second in the late 19th century, the economic drivers of colonialism shifted toward the requirements of high-tech industry. The new sectors of steel, chemicals, and electricity created a desperate demand for rubber, petroleum, and minerals like copper and tin. This triggered a new era of extraction, where the tools of the industrial age were turned back upon the colonies to accelerate the flow of wealth. The technological gap was now enforced by the Maxim gun. As the saying of the era went, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not. This weapon was not merely a tool of conquest, it was an economic enforcer that allowed small European forces to maintain control over vast territories and recalcitrant labor forces. This military dominance was paired with a revolution in communication. The introduction of the telegraph reduced the time it took for a message to travel between London and India from 2 years to just 2 days. This allowed for the real-time management of global commodity prices and the rapid deployment of troops to protect economic interests, effectively shrinking the world into a single, manageable marketplace. The colonization of the Congo under King Leopold II of Belgium represents the most extreme expression of this new plunder economy. Leopold claimed the territory as a personal venture, promising to bring civilization, but his true objective was the forced collection of wild rubber to meet the soaring demand of the burgeoning bicycle and automotive industries. To meet impossible quotas, Congolese workers were subjected to systematic mutilation and murder. The profits from this rubber fueled the growth of Belgian industry and funded the construction of grand public works in Brussels, while the Congo was left scarred by a legacy of violence and underdevelopment. Across Africa and Asia, colonial administrations imposed new tax systems designed to force indigenous people into the wage labor market. Taxes had to be paid in colonial currency, which could only be earned by working on European-owned plantations or in mines. This effectively destroyed traditional subsistence economies and integrated local populations into the global capitalist system as low-wage laborers. The infrastructure of this era, the massive railway projects and telegraph lines, was designed with a single purpose: to move raw materials from the interior to the coast as quickly as possible. These were the veins and arteries of an extractive system that pumped wealth toward the European metropoles, creating a global trade network where the rules were always written by and for the West. By the early 20th century, the economic engine of colonialism had created a world of profound structural imbalance. The wealth of the West was built on a foundation of colonial labor, stolen land, and extracted resources. The industrial cities of Europe, with their thriving markets and grand architecture, were the direct beneficiaries of a system that had systematically underdeveloped the rest of the world to fuel its own growth. This sustained period of exploitation provided the capital and the materials that allowed the West to dominate the planet, raising the question of how these deeply entrenched patterns of global trade would survive the coming cataclysms of the 20th century. Chapter 5. The Long Shadow of Empire. The era of European global dominance did not end with the lowering of flags or the signing of independence treaties. Instead, it left behind a world fundamentally restructured, with patterns of power, wealth, and identity that continue to vibrate through the present day. The transformation of once backward Western European kingdoms into the masters of 84% of the globe by 1914 created a legacy of inequality and structural imbalance that was centuries in the making. To understand the world as it exists now, one must look at the deep, often invisible imprints left by the colonial project. The institutional frameworks, the artificial political boundaries, the economic dependencies, and the profound psychological shifts that were forced upon the majority of the human population. In sharp contrast, many parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America were viewed through a different lens. In West Africa, for example, the high mortality rates for Europeans earned the region the grim nickname of the white man's graveyard. Because the environment was too hostile for large-scale European settlement, the colonial powers had little incentive to build inclusive institutions. Instead, they established extractive institutions. These were systems designed for a single purpose: to pull as much wealth, whether in the form of minerals, rubber, or labor, out of the colony as efficiently as possible and transfer it to the European metropole. These structures relied on centralized, often authoritarian control and the exploitation of the local population. When these colonies eventually gained independence, they often inherited these extractive frameworks. The new local elites frequently found it easier to maintain the existing systems of exploitation for their own benefit rather than undergoing the difficult process of building inclusive, democratic institutions from scratch. This institutional inheritance is a primary reason why many formerly colonized nations have struggled with persistent poverty and slow economic growth. The political map of the modern world is perhaps the most visible scar of the colonial era. During the 19th century scramble for Africa and similar movements in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, European diplomats drew lines on maps with little to no regard for the ethnic, cultural, or linguistic realities on the ground. At the Berlin Conference of 1884, the continent of Africa was carved into colonies that either split a single ethnic group between two or more rival administrations, or forced historically hostile groups to live within the same artificial borders. This practice of balkanization and forced amalgamation created a blueprint for future conflict. In the post-colonial era, these arbitrary borders became the boundaries of new nation-states, leading to decades of civil war, secessionist movements, and political instability as different groups struggled for control over the centralized power structures left behind by the Europeans. The decline of the great land-based empires of Eurasia was another major consequence of the European ascent. The Ottoman Empire, once a formidable power that had reached the gates of Vienna, spent the 19th century in a state of slow, painful contraction. Labeled the sick man of Europe, the Ottomans found themselves increasingly dependent on Western European powers for military support and financial stability. Despite efforts at modernization, such as those seen in Ottoman Egypt under Muhammad Ali, who introduced steam engines and weapons factories, these initiatives were often thwarted by European interference or the death of a visionary leader. By the early 20th century, the once mighty Ottoman, Mughal, and Qing empires were either dismantled or reduced to semi-colonial status, their sovereignty compromised by unequal treaties and the overwhelming military and economic pressure of the West. The economic gap that opened during the Great Divergence has only widened over time. In 1800, the income ratio between the wealthiest and poorest regions of the world was roughly 3-to-1. By 1914, this had grown to 7-to-1, and by 1975 it reached a staggering 12-to-1. This was not merely the result of Europe moving faster, it was the result of a system that systematically underdeveloped the periphery to fuel the core. The drain of wealth from regions like India was a coordinated process. Under British rule, the Indian economy was transformed from a global leader in manufacturing into a supplier of raw materials. The taxes collected from Indian peasants were used to buy Indian goods for export, effectively meaning that Britain received these products for free. The deindustrialization of Dhaka and other manufacturing centers ensured that the local population became a captive market for British factory-made goods. This pattern of exporting raw materials and importing manufactured products became a structural trap that many former colonies have found nearly impossible to escape, leaving them vulnerable to fluctuating global commodity prices and perpetual debt. The infrastructure built during the colonial period serves as a physical reminder of this extractive logic. The massive railway networks and telegraph lines that stretched across Africa and Asia were rarely designed to connect local communities or foster internal trade. Instead, they were built as direct conduits from the resource-rich interior to the coastal ports. These were the veins of an imperial body, designed to pump wealth out of the continent. Even today, many transportation networks in the developing world still reflect this radial pattern, making it easier for a country to trade with its former colonial master than with its own neighbors. The cultural and intellectual impact of European dominance was equally profound and perhaps even more enduring. The spread of European languages, English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, created a new global hierarchy of knowledge. These languages became the tools of administration, education, and international commerce, often at the expense of indigenous languages and knowledge systems. In many post-colonial societies, proficiency in the colonial language remains a prerequisite for social mobility and access to the global elite. This has led to what some have called colonial alienation, where individuals are disconnected from their own cultural heritage and forced to view the world through a Western lens. The ideology of the civilizing mission, or mission civilisatrice, was used to justify this cultural imposition. European elites believe they had a divinely ordained duty to uplift the lesser races, a sentiment famously captured in the poetry of the era as the white man's burden. This worldview portrayed colonial rule as a noble, if difficult, sacrifice made by the West for the benefit of the benighted peoples of the world. The psychological impact of this rhetoric was devastating. It aimed to inculcate an inferiority complex in the colonized, encouraging them to admire, wonder, and imitate the European model while believing that they could never truly reach that distant ideal. This internalized sense of subordination has required a long and ongoing process of decolonization that extends far beyond the political sphere. However, the legacy of European dominance is also one of hybridity and resistance. The interaction between European and indigenous cultures created new hybrid identities that challenged the binary of colonizer and colonized. In the arts, literature, and political thought, people in the colonies began to use European tools such as the printing press, the concept of the nation-state, and Enlightenment ideals of liberty and rights to argue for their own independence. The 1905 victory of Japan over Russia was a watershed moment in this process. It was the first time in the modern era that a non-European power had defeated a European one in a major war. This event electrified nationalist movements across the globe, from India to Egypt, proving that the West's military and technological edge was not an inherent trait, but a set of skills that could be learned and mastered by others. The global integration of markets and the rise of a world economy were also direct products of the colonial era. The triangular trade system, the movement of millions of people through the Atlantic slave trade and indentured servitude, and the creation of global supply chains for commodities like sugar, cotton, and rubber laid the foundation for modern globalization. While this integration brought immense wealth to the Western world and triggered the Industrial Revolution, it was built on a foundation of forced labor and stolen land. The prosperity of cities like London, Amsterdam, and Paris was directly linked to the exploitation of plantations in the Caribbean and mines in the Andes. The financial systems that emerged to support colonial ventures, joint stock companies, stock exchanges, and central banks, provided the West with the sinews of power that allowed it to project influence across oceans. These institutions allowed for the mobilization of capital on a scale that was previously unimaginable, creating a self-sustaining engine of expansion. Yet, these same systems also created a legacy of financial dependency. Many newly independent nations found themselves trapped in cycles of debt to Western banks and international institutions, often being forced to adopt economic policies that prioritize debt repayment over the social needs of their own citizens. The legal frameworks inherited from the colonial era also continue to shape post-colonial governance. European powers often imposed their own legal systems, based on principles of Roman or common law, which were often ill-suited to local contexts and ignored indigenous systems of justice. In many cases, these laws were used as instruments of control, criminalizing traditional practices and protecting the interests of the elite. The ongoing struggle to adapt these legal systems to the needs of a diverse and independent population is a central challenge for many modern states. Even the concept of the West itself is a legacy of this era. It evolved from a simple geographic term into a socio-political identity associated with progress, modernity, and the scientific method. This identity was forged in contrast to an imagined East, which was often portrayed as static, irrational, and traditional. This binary worldview allowed Europeans to define themselves as the leaders of human civilization, a perception that was reinforced by their military and technological success. The fact that the rest of the world has spent the last century trying to catch up to this Western model of development is a testament to the power of this cultural legacy. As the 20th century progressed, the two world wars exhausted the European powers and shattered the illusion of their invincibility. The process of decolonization that followed was long and often violent, as movements for self-determination challenged the remaining empires. This shift in the global order was punctuated by moments of stark geopolitical reality. The 1956 Suez Crisis, in particular, served as a symbolic end to the era of undisputed European dominance. When Britain and France attempted to seize control of the canal, they were forced to retreat under pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union, demonstrating that the old colonial masters could no longer project power or act unilaterally without the approval of the new superpowers. However, the end of formal colonial rule did not mean the end of European influence. The patterns of trade, the institutional structures, and the cultural hierarchies established during the centuries of dominance remained in place, creating a new era of neo-colonialism, where economic and cultural power replaced direct political control. The story of how a small cluster of nations on the western fringe of Eurasia came to dominate the world is a reminder of the power of political and military competition, the importance of geographic luck, and the devastating efficiency of a single-minded focus on the tools of war. The Gunpowder tournament that began in the Middle Ages created a path of development that was unique to Europe, providing the resources and the incentives to conquer the globe. The consequences of that ascent were monumental, determining who would grow rich and who would remain poor, which languages would be spoken across continents, and how the borders of the modern world would be drawn. The shadow of this era is long, and its reverberations are still felt in every corner of the planet, as societies continue to navigate the complex and often painful legacy of European global dominance. The intense military rivalry that drove European innovation also fostered a specific type of state, one that was professionalized, bureaucratically efficient, and capable of raising massive sums of revenue. This state model was exported to the rest of the world through colonization, often replacing or suppressing local forms of political organization. The modern international system of sovereign states, governed by the principles of the Peace of Westphalia, is a European invention that has become the global norm. While this system has provided a framework for international relations, it has also struggled to accommodate the diverse political traditions and realities of the non-Western world. The transition from a world of diverse, independent civilizations to one dominated by a single Western model was a fundamental rupture in human history. It was a period of unprecedented technological and scientific advancement, but it was also an era of profound human suffering and systemic injustice. The wealth and power generated by the European tournament allowed the West to bestride the world like a colossus, but it also left behind a legacy of inequality that remains the central challenge of the 21st century. The structures of the colonial era, the extractive economies, the artificial borders, and the cultural hierarchies continue to shape the opportunities and the obstacles faced by billions of people today. Understanding this history is not just a matter of looking at the past. It is a necessary step in comprehending the forces that continue to drive the modern world. Western Europe's ascent from a chaotic backwater to a global hegemon was not a historical accident, but the result of a unique convergence of factors. From the tournament model of relentless warfare and fiscal innovation to the geographic windfalls of coal and the Atlantic, Europe forged a path defined by expansion and extraction. This dominance restructured the planet, leaving a legacy of artificial borders, institutional inequality, and a global economy still shaped by Western frameworks. However, as the Great Divergence begins to narrow and new powers rise, we must ask, was the era of Western dominance a permanent shift in the human story, or merely a brief gunpowder-fueled anomaly in the long span of history? The answer continues to unfold in the shifting geopolitical tides of the 21st century. Thank you for listening.